My guest tonight, Neil Peart, the drummer and lyricist for Rush, is notorious for being uncomfortable when it comes to accolades. He's all about the work, and blatant praise makes him squirm in his seat. So tonight, I will refrain from referring to him as not only rock's greatest drummer, but one of the greatest drummers of all time. I will also not mention that Neil Peart is one of the most creative and insightful lyricists rock has ever produced, nor that he brings a level of thoughtfulness and intellect to his craft that is truly unique. I will also not allude to the fact that he has written 6 books to date, is an expert motorcycle rider, an entrepreneur, and a philanthropist. I will say that he, along with his bandmates Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson of Rush, have built a body of work that includes 20 gold and platinum studio albums. More importantly, Rush has been together 40 years and have garnered some of the most loyal fans in all of rock and roll. To celebrate that fact, Rush is about to embark on a new tour called R40 Live that will visit 34 cities throughout North America. So, rather than make Neil Peart uncomfortable by applauding his many achievements, I will simply quote Dave Grohl from their induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and I quote, "Rush built their following the right way. No hype, no bullshit. They did it from the ground up. Their legacy is incredible and their influence undeniable." And with that, I welcome Neil Peart.
Squirming over here. Many people might not know, but should, how far back you and I go. Probably 35 years. I think we've had these semi-regular conversations, and that's pretty remarkable too.
It is remarkable. I remember the very first one, and it seemed from my side that it kind of clicked right off the bat. It was fun. It was fun.
We're still talking.
We're still, yes. It says something that you would come up here. I appreciate that. Well, here we are under a beautiful full moon high in the Hollywood Hills, and we're going to have us a nice time, I think.
Yes, thank you. Glad to be here.
Let's begin with 40 years.
That's
Rush.
a good place to start, right?
Let's
if you could just
there.
start with 40 years, then you wouldn't have to start with 0.
Yeah, there you go.
But it is, of course, very amazing for the three of us to have reached such a point together and to still share a sense of humor and a sense of purpose. And as we started to plan this tour, it was remarkable how in sync that we were about what we wanted to accomplish and express and present for people and how to go about it and working out the set list and so on. Of course, there are way too many. But we said, well, we'll play this song one night and the next night we'll play this other song, and accommodating everybody's preferences and tastes. And it's more than personal. Yes, that's the way to say it. It's more than personal. You're thinking of the presentation of the band to an audience who have been around for decades also, so that they will have not necessarily expectations, but you want to deliver something worthwhile as a statement that kind of encapsulates and punctuates that time together. And I was saying we should call it a jam into the oldies would be one approach we could take. But it really was fun discussing different approaches that we might take to it, and how to choose from among all the material. And it was simply done once that the three of us started sharing email lists of songs and all that, and said, well, we played a lot of that last tour, we can set that album aside, and what about this one we haven't played for a while, and we want to do a complete chronological presentation of all that time too. So it was just nice how easily those decisions were arrived at, and anytime there was too much, and yeah, there was nobody saying, oh, I won't play that. There were too many songs that we all wanted to play and possibly resurrect, as we've done. And so we just said, okay, well, we can do those. We can do all those songs, just not all on the same night.
Well, one of the things I think speaks very loudly for the three of you is 40 years you're still together and speaking to each other. And seeming to really still enjoy each other.
Yeah, that is an unbelievable gift, and earned over time, developed and built on over time. But it's fundamentally based on the first things that we shared, which was a sense of humor. The very first day we met, we were talking about Monty Python sketches, and immediately, if you have a sense of humor in common, there's something that you can build on from there, and the same background musically, of course. So once we started music and started talking about music music and ambitions and what we'd like to do inside of an original band. That was there too, but yeah, it absolutely first started talking about funny things.
And to your point about pleasing yourselves and the fans, it's almost with your fans like playing for family, isn't it? I mean, they've been with you for so long.
Yes, and I've always said it seems kind of over reductionist to say, but it is as simply as we made the music that we liked and hoped other people would like it too. And there was a purity that we grew up with in the 60s that, you know, not to sound like an old fogey, but when I talk to someone who says, oh, I was born in 1980, oh, you missed so much.
Yeah.
You know, just an amazingly fertile creative time to have grown up in the 60s as a young musician and to start it out in the early 60s with surf music and the first British invasion. And for me, it was the second British invasion that really lit me up once I was playing drums and when I heard The Who and when I heard the Kinks and this new edgy, angry energy that was in it. That changed my world and inflamed my whole desire to play music and inspired me with how you might go about it. And I always say one reason I admired Pete Townsend in those days, he smashes guitars and read books.
Yeah, I think that you and Roger Waters and John Lennon and have dispelled that thing that our parents used to say, well, they're just dumb musicians. They don't know.
Worse than that, drummers.
Oh, yeah. You know, and the Doors, for example, every one of those guys got a college degree, you know. Brian May, now Dr. Brian May.
Really?
No dummy.
How are you going to beat that?
Exactly. How are Geddy and Alex taking this milestone?
I think all of us just, there are so many emotions involved, and gratitude just leaped into my mind of one reason to have achieved what we have in this time. And yes, we're grateful for what we are right now, but the road that's brought us here, of course, all seems so vivid. And the language among us are memories and catchphrases and incidents going back through all of those years and the struggling years of the 70s and all that. And yes, especially in the last 10 years, have received every accolade and praise and honorary degree, you know, that you can be presented with. So that is a wonderful feeling, and been honored as individual instrumentalists, and every facet of what we do really has been appreciated over time. And, you know, that appreciation wasn't always there. Surprise. But it really, the last decade, that kind of feedback has come back on us in a very gratifying way. So I think we're very comfortable and happy about that, and consequently comfortable and happy going into celebrating our 40th anniversary. And of course, you know, there are people that are neurotic about aging, and I don't get that at all. You know, I'm 62.5 years old, and I'm proud of it. You know, like I said before, anyone younger, I think they missed out on what we got to live through. You know, again, I'm grateful for that, and I think, you know, I've survived longer than a lot of our rock and roll peers have. I'm grateful of that for that, and always aware of it, and consequently go into this with a really healthy attitude towards, yes, we survived 40 years as a band, and yes, I played the drums for 50 years this September, and yes, I've been around 62.5 years, so that's all sweet to me.
And something to be proud of. You know?
I am. Survival is, like survival alone, is something to be proud of, honestly.
I think that our generation still has that thing in the back of our head when we were young, don't trust anybody over 30. So, you know, now look at us. You know?
Well, I hope I get it before I get old and all that. You know, Pete Townsend's really tired of hearing about that. Mm-hmm. But it was an attitude of youth and freshness and rebellion and knowing it all. You know, that those are natural recourses of youth to hide from your insecurity and your ignorance about everything. That you pretend that what you are is all there is. And then as you learn and grow up with that, you go, if you're open to it and not afraid of change and growth and learning and all that, then it becomes a happy thing. And learning more is not a challenge or a threat. It's a reward and a stimulation.
Well, you know, you mentioned that, you know, you guys have finally been recognized for the great musicianship that, oh, I almost gave you a compliment. I'm sorry. I don't want to do that.
Careful. I'm squirming.
I know you're squirming. But as Dave Grohl said, their legacy is incredible and the influence on it now. But he said that you did earn it from the ground up. That's true with you guys, because when Rush first came out, the fans got it, some of the fans, but not the critics didn't flock to being Rush fans at the beginning.
Well, nor fans, honestly, we had to build that up the hard way by playing. We were an opening act for everybody that was around in the '70s. You know, you mentioning, oh yeah, we opened for them. Oh yeah, we opened for them, and so we learned it was a good object lesson to have come up a bit slowly. And our first 3 albums certainly were just on a plateau that allowed us to get gigs, and that was about it. And if we were opening for somebody bigger on a tour, maybe on days off, we'd play a club or even high schools. You know, all of that was still a part of our working life at the time, and so we had time to adjust and to see how other bands were dealing with fame and the conflicts of it, and it became an object lesson. Okay, don't be like that. You know, there are inspirations in life, but I'm not sure how you would define a negative inspiration, but as much as I would say early on, oh, I want to be like that, I want to be that kind of musician, I want to be that kind of hero. You know, lately I've had an idea that came to me in mind that when you aren't a hero in school, in sports, really for a young boy, especially a young male, if you're not good in sports, you have no chance to be a hero. So you kind of turn inward and you want to be your own hero, and you emulate the musicians that you admire and set a good example for you. But as we were coming up, and we were in our early 20s at this point, in the mid 70s, so a kind of a formative age, or early adulthood, I suppose, even for a male. And we did have both object lessons that were inspirational and others that were instructional, I guess, and okay, don't be like that.
You know, one of the great things about having some miles under your belt, I learned a long time ago in doing the interviews, is that the people who were just starting out, had one hit and thought they were Elvis, had the attitude. George Harrison came here one time and spent the first 10 minutes making me feel comfortable. Because what did he have to prove?
Yeah, right.
You know, and he had gone through all of that, and I just thought that was, you know, a great lesson.
And that's a nice way to define it, too. And it's liberating in a sense. And another way that I like to ascribe to it, we're kind of, like, people don't understand what Freddie Mercury meant by "we are the champions of the world." In the olden days, even before we walked the earth, if a village was fighting with another village, instead of going to war, they'd pick their strong guy to go fight against the strong guy in the other village. That was the champion. And what Freddie Mercury meant by that is, we're the champions for you, right? We're out here fighting that battle. And there's a kind of a privilege and responsibility on you, I think. And people say, well, why did you keep taking lessons and try so hard and go off into big band music and all that stuff? And I said, well, I do consider that a responsibility. I've been allowed to be a professional musician. Are you kidding? You know, I've been able to spend my life being a professional musician. So there's a certain responsibility that goes with that to live up to, I believe. And I always felt that, okay, you can never be too good. You can never, you know, your last show might have been okay, but guess what? There's another one tomorrow night. And those kind of self-imposed pressures, I guess, in the same sense of trying to be your own hero, it did come to me that, yes, okay, I have this position as a champion to speak. And a lot of times, just talking about lyrics and that, it is anger and outrage that inspires me to try to put that into words for other people. And going back, like a song like Subdivisions, that was a song about us, but it was a song about so many other people too, right? And that we could put into words what it was like to grow up in that cookie cutter kind of environment and try to find a way out of it. You know, that's what we shared early on, that suburban rebellion, you might call it, with our audience, and we're able to bring them forward with us because they shared it.
And that you mentioned a song that resonated with so many people who were having trouble fitting in, and those years are just can be brutal on people.
Well, yes, and I always I used a line in The Clockwork Angels about "wish I could live it all again," and I have never felt that way.
No.
Right? I do not want to go back. But my late drum teacher, Freddie Gruber, was fading in his 80s, and he had lived through the jazz. The golden years of jazz in the 40s and the early 50s in New York City, and been part of that whole scene. He said, oh, I had quite a ride. I wish I could do it all again. So I adapted that line to my character in the song, but I have never felt that way. And maybe when I'm 80, I will, but for now, I'm glad to have done it all once, but oh no, not going back.
Well, also, you're not done yet, and you keep looking forward. And I think you're and we're going to get into the book here in a moment, but everything about that book is you're just taking life and sucking it in, and chewing on it and making sure that you taste every flavor of it. So with that attitude, it's not like, well, I want to go back and have the chocolate that I had when I was 16, because there's better chocolate out there you haven't discovered yet.
Right on. Yeah, and that's a quarrel I have with nostalgia a lot of times, really, when people are into old instruments and all that, and drums, for example, just to pick the prettiest instrument. Old drums are nice, but new ones are better. Old motorcycles are nice, but new ones are better.
Well, we're talking with Neil Peart, getting ready for their 40th anniversary tour, to be in the limelight again, but I'm going to do my best not to give him any compliments for the next hour and 45 minutes on Deep Tracks. Never before have I heard of a rocker writing a song about, I love you guys, but just, I'm not comfortable with all of that. And it's really well done in that. Neil Peart is my guest. We're talking about Rush, talking about the 40th anniversary tour. But right now, we're going to talk about your new book.
Oh, great.
This is your 6th.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Some people would be happy with a career if they wrote 6 books.
I was happy to write one, honestly, and that's an example of how your goals increase. And people will often say to me in the band part, did you ever dream you'd play in Maple Leaf Gardens or Madison Square Garden? No, I dreamed of playing at the roller rink in the high school, one step at a time. And same thing when I first started writing was in, I always love to recount this because around the time 2112 came out and we were on tour, and touring had always been tedious for me, and people would presume to be jaded and say, oh, when did you feel that way? And I said, after 1 month, I realized there's so much empty time here, and reading became my escape and a nurturing way to actually spend that time instead of just killing it. Yeah, not killing time, but spending it. So in 1976, I went to a pawn shop in Little Rock, Arkansas, and bought myself a typewriter. I thought, I'm going to write. And it was 20 years before I published my first book, in which time I learned how to do it and had expert tutelage and worked on the craft until that point. So yes, I would absolutely, just publishing one book would have been the ultimate goal for me at the time.
Well, let's talk about the new book here for a moment. I'm sorry, before we do, because you brought up something, I don't want to forget this. Writing a book, perhaps unlike working with a band and lyrics, it's a very solitary experience, isn't it?
Yeah, it is initially, but there is good collaboration available there if you're open to it. I love working with editors, for example, which some writers might not say, but yeah, I've had nothing but great experiences in the collaboration of that. And even doing the Clockwork Angels novel, for example, with Kevin Anderson, and then I recorded the audiobook for it, and it was a 4-day experience of sitting in a little studio, not unlike this, and being so careful not to move or make a sound. And I was working with a female engineer and producer, the engineer listening to every sound that came out of my mouth, and the producer watching for pronunciations and voice timbres and all that sort of thing. And the end of those days working together, it's felt like such a tight collaborative unit. That's always my favorite way to work, is in a group, a small group like that. And I was mentioning we've just finished a graphic novel version of Clockwork Angels, and working with Kevin and myself and the editors and the artist. And I called us the Quorum because we were making all the decisions and deciding what was best for the story and all the way along. And I thought, you know what? This is the size of a rock band. There were 5 of us in there. I thought most of my working life has been in groups of 3, 4, 5 people creating something together like that. And it's the situation that I love. And I thought maybe all institutions in life should be run by rock bands. Including government. If you had 5 people, say, making all the decisions, right, for what was best for the country, what was best for your vision and all that stuff, I think it would probably work.
Yeah, right. All right, let's talk about the new book, Far and Near on Days Like These, in which you talk at length. I love this at the beginning of the book. You talk at length about the importance of creating a physical object like a book or DVD or what have you, and how much care one should take to get it right. You're very big on making sure that you do it as best you can.
Well, it's something that absolutely reflects in the band's approach, that every show that we do was always the one, and every record we make, comes with the sense of care. And I mentioned in there that if someone's listening to a drum part, I don't expect them to hear paradiddles and polyrhythms and cross-stickings and all the other elements of technique that I worked on so hard. But in the sense of listening to a Rush song or looking at a Rush album when such things existed, or one of my books, people will just receive a sense that care has been taken here. And I think that's a value that when I look at art and paintings or watch a movie even, you get that sense right away that care has been taken here in the making of it, and it puts you at ease, that right away what the artist in whatever medium is trying to reach you for real. They're not trying to fool you, they're not trying to sell you something, they're trying to communicate something with care. And I think that speaks in an intangible way, but undeniably true, that people get that. I remember Nick Hornby, the British novelist, has written quite a bit about pop music, and he says when he talks to someone young listening to music, starting to get into it, he said, whatever you listen to, just make sure they mean it.
Well, that's a great point, and that brings me to the obvious question. Do you think, without naming names, that the current crop of pop musicians who seem to be more concerned, to me, about their choreography and their costume than the
Well,
music?
the magic word, pop, stands for popular. And then again, another thing I learned from art history and criticism, from my self-given education, though, it was one set of standards from this art historian, Professor Gombrich, who said, how do you judge a piece of art? What are they trying to do, and how well do they do it? If they're trying to be popular and they do it, I guess they win. And that's a perfect example. I drive up and down California quite a lot, and sometimes just bounce around radio stations, as curiosity. And I was driving down through Central California and picked up a hip-hop station from Fresno. And I thought, okay, I'm going to listen to a hip-hop station from Fresno, California. So for 2 hours, I just listened to it, and I had an insight after it. You're not hearing any drumming going on, so that automatically, and same with all pop music, right? There's no drumming in it. There's no drums. So I don't get that personal satisfaction of the element of music that spoke to me most strongly from the beginning. But what I realized listening to these artists whose name you usually only see in the gossip pages, in each case they have a gift that other people can't do. And that is what makes athletics work, that's what makes entertainment work, and why these people can admire someone who can speak a whole bunch of rhymes really fast, because they can't do it, right? It's as simple as that. So all these artists that they like, it's a style that has evolved among their generation. So you can't judge hip-hop music, for example, on rock band standards. But when I listen to it just freshly like that and say, well, what is this made of? And why do people like it? And I realized that as I was listening to all the celebrated artists of that kind of music for 2 hours, mind you. So I was already hearing the same songs again. But I realized, well, yeah, these people have a gift that's inimitable. And that's what makes them work for these people. But when you mention pop music, that is simple, really. Pop music stands for popular. Rock music stands for rock.
If you could hang with rap music for 2 hours, mister, you're a better man than I.
Well, I have an open mind.
Mister, you're a better man than I.
Wide open.
Okay. In the book, it became clear very soon on that you have an amazing eye for detail, describing everything from the colors of new growth along the roadways in spring to the texture of icy mountain roads and how that would differ. Did you always have this kind of eye for detail, or did it improve with your writing?
Oh, very good question, because yes, I certainly started out as a nature lover, for example, as a small boy, and responded to that, and to reading also was a huge magnet to me as a youngster. And then one of the greatest exercises that I use in writing as I'm riding along on my motorcycle is, how would I describe this in words, right? And oftentimes if I'm wrestling with emotions, and how would I put this in words, is a constant exercise for me that's great therapy, because one of the things that keeps me as a dedicated letter writer, for example, is a phrase I like to twist around, but it goes, how do I know what I think until I see what I write? So you develop the technique over time, as in music, to convey yourself more clearly. So I play that exercise all the time if I'm looking around at the world as I go by. How does this make me feel, and how would I put this into words? So that is absolutely a childhood influence, but it's informed by, as in music, a dedication to the craft of communicating it more clearly and more movingly, if I can.
Well, because the beginning of the book is almost Michener-esque in its detail. You know, it's like, it kind of reminded me of the opening to Hawaii, you know, where, okay, I got
First
it. First
there was a volcano.
Yes, exactly, exactly. But you make it a bit more entertaining than that. I like, this is another thing that I really enjoyed about the book and learned from the book, is I like the fact that you take the time to learn the history of the particular area that you're writing through, like explaining, and I love this, the deforestation of the English oaks, and how those hills used to be covered.
Well, chestnuts. And the Appalachians, the chestnut was the predominant tree until a blight came from Europe and wiped them out. Yeah. Those are things that I learned through recreational reading, I guess you would say. I'd read quite a lot of novels, literary novels that also include that kind of knowledge in them. So I bring that to me, and then I get curious, and I'll see a kind of plant and go, what is that? And that's one example. I was riding through the East Coast in springtime and kept seeing, before the trees had leaves or blossoms, these beautiful kind of magenta colored flowers kept coming out.
Right.
And all through the next couple of weeks, I was asking people, what are those called? What are those called? And nobody knew. And then finally I found out they're called red buds. I was like, oh, okay. So if I can put a name to something too, of course it helps me a lot to define it for other people. And I always say I like to try to write about motorcycling for people who don't care anything about motorcycling. Try to write about nature for people who don't particularly care about nature. If I write about the band, people sometimes, why do you always say your bandmate Eddie? Say, well, I'm writing for somebody who doesn't know who Rush is, you know, as far as I'm concerned as a writer. And so if I can weave history into it, and I've learned too where to leave that alone and say, okay, people, there's some really interesting stories here. I'll leave you to follow up further if you like, but you have to know how far a disinterested reader, as opposed to uninterested, but someone who has no inclination either way, how far you can take them, and then, okay, that's as far as I'm going to lead you, and if you want to go farther, there are many, many, many more stories that I leave out because they're of interest to me for having visited a place and for being in a context of the Midwest or the prairies or the deserts or the mountains, all these regionalisms that I'm so attuned to, both from traveling and from reading. There's a certain level of interest that I can count on, I think, if I can phrase it right, to tell somebody about motorcycling or car racing or birds, you know, my common fixations. And then at a certain point that I know, okay, those people have probably heard enough about hummingbird nesting habits by now.
Well, you went on about, do you pronounce it gorse, G-O-R-S?
Yeah.
And I found that fascinating. I'd never heard of the plant. I didn't know that after, now this was in England.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, Ireland.
Right, in Ireland. And after
Great Britain.
Because they lost these forests not only to the Romans, but then when the Romans left, they were building all those ships when England ruled the waves, all out of oak. So that,
in Canada too, in eastern Canada, our main trees were the giant oaks and pines, and they were marked for the British Navy, the Royal Navy.
Yeah.
Any of them over 3 feet in diameter were reserved for the British Navy for all those ships of the Napoleonic Wars and all that. But more so, when I was traveling, motorcycling through Britain, I was seeing all these beautiful leather, yellow-flowered plants at the roadside. And again, what are they? What are they? And finally figured out what it was. And then the history of them, going back to Thomas Hardy novels and all that, talking about firs, and the Led Zeppelin album cover, just to swing us back to rock and roll here, where the old man with the sticks, that's gorse. And he was collecting firewood because it's a greasy kind of wood that burns really well. And the Romans had used it for harvesting salt. And yes, all of those mountains that I was looking at, why are these mountains bare? Well, they weren't always bare, but for firewood and for building ships and all of that, they were stripped bare and didn't grow back.
And you explained that this gorse has an interesting quality. When it's dried, it becomes oily, and it's very good fuel, and that's why you see people using it and so on. Well, see, now that's something I wouldn't have expected to learn from a rock and roll guy, and I appreciated that, because I'd never known that. When you, in the book, you speak a lot about, you have two main writing partners. Brutus.
The legendary Brutus.
Legendary Brutus. And some guy named Michael. Some dude named Michael. And what is this guy like to ride with? I mean, you have to spend a lot of time with him. He's a pain in the ass, is what you were telling me earlier, right? I mean, when we were alone, you were just saying that.
No, it's funny. We both abuse each other so constantly that, for instance, one of the assistants that works for me sometimes was talking about it, says, you guys talk so awful to each other all the time. And both of us looked at each other blankly like, what do you mean? But we maintain this constant level of abuse so that it never bubbles up into anger or, interpersonal tension and all that. But of course, it's a difficult relationship, traveling every day through who knows what kind of hardships and weather and all that. So it requires a certain resilience and patience and humor. Oh, does it need humor, to be able to, because that's one thing I've learned in the dynamics of my life. The first thing that happens after tragedy is, guess what? Comedy, right? And the black comedy and horrible jokes that people in terrible situations of grief can make are wonderful. The essence of humanity and hopefulness, and always seeing the bizarre side, not necessarily the bright side, but the humorous, twisted side of situations is constantly amazing to me, how people can do that.
Yeah, the gallows humor, if you will.
Yes.
Well, also because the fact is that you're men, and men, a way that we show affection for other men is to bust their balls. And my wife is constantly aghast when I will talk to a friend of mine on the phone, a very good friend of mine who I love dearly, and all it is throwing insults back and forth at each other. And she goes, why do you talk to him that way? I said, well, because we're great friends. Yeah. That's the way that we relate to each other.
And if you couldn't do that too, there you raise a very good point about a person in my position too, who you can become isolated, right, and surrounded by agreeers, yes men, and people who bow to your wishes and all that, and people do build structures around themselves like that. Whereas I never wanted that, and as a band we didn't. We were always close with our crew, and in the earlier shared rooms with them, and always maintained that relationship where they could insult us if they wanted to, and it keeps you honest. And among my best friends in the business, the people that I'm close to, we do have that kind of abusive relationship where you are able to insult each other. And mentioning Michael, here's a wonderful quote where he was berating me about something, and I said, I love the fact that you think you can talk to me like that, but I really wish you wouldn't.
Yes. I really wish you wouldn't. Oh, God.
But it didn't stop him.
No. What was the most dangerous moment that you and Michael ever faced on one of these treks? Because, first off, maybe I ought to say to people that don't know that when you are on tour, as much as possible, you ride your bike from the one gig to the next.
Yeah.
Why don't you explain that
Yeah,
first?
sure. The basic framework, after a show, I run straight onto the bus, and I will have asked our bus driver, Dave, to drop us at a certain junction where the back roads start. And we'll just sleep on the bus and have breakfast there, usually in a Walmart parking lot or a convenient truck stop. And then in the morning, unload the bikes and set off. And I will have looked at the maps the previous day, and wherever I have to go, there is an interesting way to get there, maybe an interesting little town or a bit of history along the way, Thomas Jefferson's house or a Frank Lloyd Wright building or whatever, some excuse, right, to take that road. And so, we'll ride all that day, and then toward the end of that day, toward cocktail time, I think, okay, it's time to start looking for a place to stay. And I've got confident over the years where I can do that. And you pick a town of a certain size, I'll know they have a few motels, and I'll go there and look them over and say, okay, let's try this mom and pop place. And the next morning we'll get up and ride to the show. So, for instance, on the last tour, I think we rode 28,000 miles around North America mostly, but also around Europe and South America on one tour. I looked at the itinerary and thought, 4 days between Brazil and Argentina. We could do that.
Whoa.
That's what I called in the story. It was in the previous book, Far and Away. It's the last story in that book, but it was called Magical Thinking because I believed it could be done. But the danger part of it on a motorcycle is ever present. And as the dangerous moment, we probably never knew. Somebody probably went by us in a truck whose brakes had gone out and missed us. One time on the freeway, you would think you were safe. We were riding east on I-40 through Oklahoma City, and just a lane over and 2 seconds ahead of us, a gardener's truck launched a giant wheelbarrow into the air in front of us, and I'm watching this. Where's it going to land? Where's it going to bounce to? The adventures we've had, I document pretty thoroughly in the book, of getting lost in the desert and lost down a one-way road to nowhere, and all these kind of things happen to us regularly because I search out those kind of roads, and we call them the mystery roads when they come up on the GPS, because the GPS isn't sure about them, the map isn't sure about them, but we have time, and we always have lots of gas and say, okay, let's explore. We can always turn around. So the adventure is there, but the danger is, despite statistics that will say that the freeways, are safer to travel on than back roads. Well, for me, on my motorcycle, I'm way safer on a back road with my own destiny in my hands and keeping an eye on the road conditions and the traffic, riding sensibly, riding not by speed limits, by what the road tells me and the weather tells me. Whereas on the freeway, I really feel helpless. So again, that's where it's counterintuitive in a sense that I know, okay, statistically you're supposed to be safer on freeway, but no. The most dangerous times of somebody losing their attention ahead of you, and the vision that you get around you, motorcycle senses are, if you survive, are remarkably acute. And I carry them into driving now, and I realize that I'm absorbing information at motorcycle speed.
Very good. Neil Peart, motorcyclist, and drummer of Rush. Rush and Ghost Rider, and my guest tonight is Neil Peart, the drummer and lyricist for Rush, and we're talking about the 40th anniversary tour and also his brand new book, Far and Near, which is just fascinating. On another subject, Universal is going to reissue your catalog in vinyl. Is this true?
Yes.
Tell us about that.
I know. It's we have always, I think, every record has come out on vinyl to the few hundred people who are interested. And, as far as we're concerned, of course, it's beautiful to see the 12 by 12 format for your album art. So that's one reward right there. And whatever medium, you talked before about objects too. And the one thing that I think is lost in the digital world, although there are many rewards and many ways in which I use it myself, but I do love holding a book in my hand is a way different thing to looking at my story on screen. There's just a feeling about that and what it used to be, an album or a CD, DVD, especially a book, I guess, because so much time has gone into that object. So for anyone who's still interested in a piece of art, really. That's the way it always was, as we conceived the music, of course. And in the old days of side one and side two, they were absolutely sets of music to us. And we chose the songs very carefully for those roles and tried different orders of songs and all that. When you had two sides, it was that much more complicated. And then the album cover art, of course, all of those years, again, care has been taken. It was always important. And tour books were important, too. Again, another object that people can hold and look at over time. That's the other aspect of it too. And there's a certain idea that things that are on the internet are permanent in a way, but they don't feel permanent, do they? They feel totally transitory. And I've had trouble turning over to ebook reading, for example. And one of my greatest presents to buy for people at Christmas is books. And this year, for the first time, I realized more and more of my friends are reading ebooks. Am I really burdening them by giving them this lump of paper, that they might not want to carry around with them? So that's always my first go-to for presents for people. I can always choose books for anyone. I have a sense for that like in conversation, I will always have one subject in conversation in common with someone, and I can always pick a book for anyone that I know well enough to. And that saddened me this year, realizing, oh no, my go-to choice and my most satisfying choice for friends was to give them a book that I thought they would enjoy. So those kind of things, you can't buy music for people very well anymore. more, as soon as it's going to be the same with books. So objects remain a certain talisman quality for people still, and vinyl, of course, is the extreme of it. And regardless of the taste or what you hear or think you hear in that medium, it doesn't matter. The fact that it's of value to you, as an object in the way that my books are to me, that's beautiful.
And there is a resurgence of interest in vinyl, a big resurgence, and even among younger people, I think.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, absolutely so.
I have some questions from my friend Dominic Nardella, who you know.
Yes, we met at our previous interview under the same terms.
Yes.
He did well last time. We'll give him another break.
We'll give him another shot, because he had some good questions. And being lazy, I thought, well, good.
Yeah, really.
Excellent. Less work for Jim. His first question is, any plans for additional musicians on this tour similar to the Clockwork Angels String Ensemble?
Oh, beautiful question. No, but for all good reasons. We were so grateful to have accomplished that, and they talked about it for years. Oh, wouldn't a string section be great? Oh, yeah, that would be great. And finally made it happen, and enjoyed it so much, not just musically, and I've written about that in the book too, what it meant to us socially to have somebody else but us to talk to every day. And it became a ritual. Every day we'd come in for sound check in the afternoon. We would march up on stage over to the string riser and talk with them, and share the day off, socializing and all that. So it really broadened our world for that tour, and it was so satisfying, of course, how great they sounded on stage and their energy that they brought to their performance, because all of them, of course, if you're a violinist or a cellist, you come up through the classical world that's pretty sober in many ways. And for them to be in a rock band and to feel like a rock band and to be allowed to feel part of it, as they certainly were working with us, was a charge for them. And that charge, which is totally the right word, electrified them, and it came out with them on stage. And having that energy field around us was so great. But having done it, it's like, okay, we did that wonderful thing. And now I think in this tour, really, the basics aspect of being a trio is appealing because of that, because we went to the other extreme, right? We did it, accomplished it, loved it, are so grateful for the results of the recordings and the video that we made of that tour and everything. So having done that, check. Now I said, okay, what about the three of us again?
Yeah. Especially the 40th anniversary, I would think, would require the three of you.
Yeah, well, really, yes.
His next question, is it possible that on the R40 tour, Rush may perform a song that they have never played live? He goes on to make a suggestion. Fan polls are leaning towards Losing It from the Signals album being the one song that would, well, to quote Dominic, would lose their shit if the band played.
Can you say that on the radio?
Apparently not.
Well, yes, we have talked about every aspect. As I mentioned, we really threw an open field to ourselves in terms of song selection, and we let certain albums that we represented a lot in recent tours to say, okay, we don't have to do that album, those songs. So we want to touch on the high points along the way and make a kind of a digest for ourselves chronologically. And yes, there are songs being discussed that are deep tracks. And that was even one theme that we even talked about that theme, should we do that? I said, no, what we do want to celebrate is the high points where we reached the audience.
Right.
A lot of the deep tracks for us might have been disappointing, not necessarily as a piece of work, but because they spoke to us so well and that maybe didn't bridge that gap to the listener. You can't always make the communication leap that you hope for.
Right.
One reason that Geddy always defined mixing as the death of hope. There were a lot of songs that we had.
I love that line.
Yeah, I know. It's wonderful. I always call it the death of waiting because I'm impatient. But there are those songs that you really had aspirations for more than that, passionate hope for, that for one reason or another didn't realize themselves and maybe didn't reach the audience as strongly as other ones did. So that's fine, and you still treasure them yourselves and maybe hope in another lifetime you can redo it and get it right. But on the other hand, of course, we have a wide body of work that did reach the listeners, and sometimes in a profound way as part of their lives. And one subtitle I used in one of my books, Traveling Music, was The Soundtrack of My Life. And I know that resonates with our audience, and I see them. There might be a mom and a dad there with their kids, and maybe grandpa and grandma too. And we've been able to speak across that generation, even as musicians. It's wonderful that Taylor Hawkins told me a story a while ago that he had bought one of the banners for my Tama drums floating on the lake. That was a advertising thing that the Tama Drum Company did in the early 80s. And it was an inspiration to him as a kid. So he bought one on eBay. And I was writing about the old days. I toured the studio, Le Studio in Quebec this summer, that's long abandoned for about 15 years, and walked through all those memories and looked out at the lake and remembered my drums on the lake out there. And I wanted to use that illustration. And I remembered Taylor. I said, Taylor, can you send me a picture of that banner so I can use it? And he sends me a picture of his son in front of it, holding up his drumsticks, and it's like, okay, down to another generation of inspiration. And that is just, as pure drummer is wonderful. But on the whole, I was saying before that songs that rose out of our youthful frustrations and youthful mysteries and wonderings and all that, sometimes at best, like I mentioned the example Subdivisions, which is pretty hard to beat in terms of background and its resonance for us and so many others, and that becomes someone else's touchstone too. So that when they hear that on the radio, I think in one of the stories in the book I was writing about all the things that can trigger memory, sense of smell is said to be one of the great ones and all that. But is there any vehicle? Time machine. I was writing about time machines and what a drum set is, and an old drum set is a kind of a time machine. Any old instrument is. But is there any greater vehicle to convey you through time than a song? Yeah. I don't think so. There are many things that trigger your memories, but there's sometimes you can hear a song that maybe you haven't even thought of for decades if you have achieved age like we have, proudly, right? You'll hear a song that you haven't heard in so long and go, wow, and then boom, right back to that time. Yeah. And check your premises too. I loved about that. Somebody sent me a link to a concert that was done that was supposed to be the last of the super concerts done in Britain in 69 or so. And the opening band was Colosseum. And a band I loved back in that time, a drummer that was just great, John Heisman. And I watched a bit of it. I wonder if he is as good as I thought he was. And sure enough, I watched him play, and he had beautiful technique and posture, and his musicianship was impeccable. I said, okay, good. When I was a 15-year-old kid, I knew what a good drummer should sound like. So that's the vehicle of music in terms of memory like that. So I recognize that our fans over that time, there are certain songs that for them are not just about that moment, but all the moments since, and it encapsulates so much for them, not necessarily nostalgia. And I don't think of us as nostalgia or those songs. And you were just playing Free Will, for example. That still sounds good to me, and I'd still have you to play that song. Yeah. So that's a good point of reference for ourselves, too. I'm not distant from that song at all. It still resonates for me.
Great answer. Great. He's got two more here. And I thought this was fascinating because I didn't know this about you. Dominic wants to know, do you still personally make the pre-show mixtape that the audience hears as they are entering the venue waiting for Rush to take the stage?
I do. I have done that since, since the late 70s. I used to make them all, and at that time when there was a lot of current music in the same sort of taste area as ours, and I would push it a bit through the early 80s and all that. I remember playing a lot of what was called New Wave and New Romantics at the time that I really liked, because I was still, and am still, very much a music fan. But yes, I do, but I've moved more into the field of classic rock to find the musical relationship to the show that we're about to perform has to relate to the music played before. So right. I find myself much more going to the music that formed us, which is perfect too. Before the show, the audience is hearing music that I've chosen, and the other guys often suggest things, or I'll check, what about that? Music that was formative to us plays before we come on and play the music that we formed.
So you're finding the deep tracks.
Exactly so. Name. Let's do that again.
Okay. Last question from Dom here. What was your reaction when you got the call that Rush was being inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame?
Well, I've been at pains before in writing about that, and it's easier when you're sitting in front of a keyboard with words that I can wrestle around to get the right answer. But it is a conflicting thing, because you're not supposed to feel too good about yourself, right? And before that, also, because we had been denied so long, we had to poo-poo it and say, in fact, in my acceptance speech on the night, I said, for years we've been saying this is no big deal. It turns out it kind of is. So had to kind of readjust our attitude towards it, because it was being presented to us with such sincerity, and that night, our audience in that building that night they ruled the place. So that was part of what inspired my comments.
I'm sorry, I was in the audience that night. They more than ruled it. That was it for them. I mean, every time anyone would even get the first syllable of Canada out
Yeah.
of their mouth, the audience would erupt.
Yeah. So, and with other awards and all that, you can't take them too seriously, and yet you have to take them seriously. So that's the inner debate that has to go on in a case like that. Of course, I appreciate this. I'm honored by it, and I always said, okay, we'll keep trying to live up to this. That's the best way to do it. If you get a Hall of Fame award or a Lifetime Achievement Award, well, our lifetimes aren't over yet. Our careers aren't over, so we have to keep trying to live up to that faith that people put in you, right? When people invest you that way, they put faith in you. So you got to live up to that.
Well, that's fantastic. It's fantastic. Let me take you back to the book for a minute.
Yeah, please.
If I can. And I love the commentary in your book, Far and Near, about the church signs that you saw while driving through the Bible Belt. This was very interesting.
Yeah.
Give us a couple of your favorites if you can remember them.
Well, there are so many. Well, there's one that I actually do like because some of them are simply moronic and some of them are just preaching in fire and brimstone, you're going to hell and all that. But the one I do love that has a certain tongue-in-cheek wisdom is, if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans.
Yes, yes.
So there are lots of them, and it's funny. It's not something I think about when I'm in Canada. It's not something I think about in California or in Europe. But when I travel in those places where it's being rammed down your throat, I have to go, oh, wait a minute, no, this is so wrong, and it riles me up. And I mentioned before that anger and outrage can sometimes be an inspiration, and it gets me writing about it. And people will say, why are you a faith basher? And I said, well, I don't feel like a faith basher, and it's not something I've thought about all day. It's something that my life has been full without any of that aspect. I don't really understand it or understand why it's needed, and it's a kind of brainwashing in almost all cases where poor children have been brought up and formed into these molds, right? That you are suddenly, this ism is after your name from the time you're born. They don't choose it, and for whatever reasons they never do question it, where I did from the beginning. When I went to Sunday school as a little kid, and when I would they'd tell us to sing the song God watches each sparrow fall and all that, and I said, well, no, I don't really think so. And when you look at the world now, I saw the comic and the great writer Stephen Fry the other day talking about that. He said, how can you, and they said, what if you went to heaven and meet God? He said, oh, that wouldn't be a pleasant meeting. You say, why did you create those parasites that grow behind babies' eyes and destroy their vision on the way out and all that? That's not any kind of a God to be worshiping, is it?
Plus, I think that if there is an omnipresent being that is that smart, he's going to be looking at your heart, not what you put in the collection plate.
And I always say that too. If I'm going to go up and meet St. Peter and Jesus and God and Allah and Buddha, whichever one you want to pick, I'm going to be okay, because I have lived a life based on that, and I believe in generosity and charity and kindness and courtesy. Those are just things that seem good to me anyway. I don't need a threat to make me behave that way, and I don't need a reward. It's always the carrot and the stick in that aspect of, oh, never mind how lousy this life is because you're going to go to heaven. Well, no, that doesn't work too well. Or you better behave or you're going to hell. Those are the only two sides that religion really gives you, and I just don't find them necessary. So I get curious and go, why do other people need this invisible friend? That's one of the nicest definitions of my invisible friend can beat up your invisible friend.
Didn't you refer to God as the Christian sky god in your book?
Yeah, another way, if you go back to the pagan religions, and again, I'm open to all that. I'm not a cynic. And when I travel in Africa, I'm very interested in their pantheism and how they ascribe spirituality to everything around them. The religions are a search. They're not an end.
There you go.
And I admire that spiritual search. I don't feel in need of it, but if it's innocent and doesn't harm children, then it's okay.
Because, and this is this line, Clockwork Angels, which reminded me of the story in Genesis about do not eat from the tree of knowledge. What?
Yeah.
Wait a minute, why do you not want me to eat from the tree of
That
knowledge?
quote from the lean not upon your own understanding. It's like, what? Wait a minute. Well, so I shouldn't think. And of course, that is the necessary doctrine that you're hit with. And again, I don't think about these things because they don't matter. And in most of the world, they actually don't. You can go to the pockets of extremism in the Middle East and the Middle South, and they're going to be rammed down your throat. And they're dangerous in that context. They're like a tinderbox of fire that can be lit into this strange kind of murderous faith. Like, we can murder these people because God said.
Yes. I always think that if there is a God, these assholes go up there and meet him, he's going to say, man, you really misread the book.
I said,
you
are you
really
serious?
didn't get it.
Really?
And I do like that line you're about to quote, lean not upon your own understanding. Ignorance is well and truly blessed. All right.
Just do what you're told, right?
Yeah. Neil Peart, my guest tonight on Deep Tracks. Title track to Clockwork Angels from Rush. My guest tonight, Neil Peart, drummer and lyricist of Rush. Let me stick with with religion here for just a moment.
If you insist.
I know this is not getting you in any trouble with anybody. Was there ever a time in your life when you did believe? And if so, what changed your mind? Was it an event, or was it like a process?
Good question. And in fact, no, there was never a time when I believed. And as a child going to Sunday school, it was a questioning. It's like, really? The omnipresent being and the beneficent sky god confused me at the time. And once I was old enough, I always remember that as a teenager in my bedroom at home, I got spray cans and sprayed graffiti on there, and I took the Nietzsche God is dead. And my parents not being particularly religious, but they had, oh my God, your grandmother will die if she sees that. So I spray painted it to be God isn't dead. It didn't matter to me, and it made peace, etc. But no, there never was a time that I did. I was always curious, though, and I was always open to it. And as I got into adult life, I would learn about different religions and philosophies and say, well, is there anything here for me? And sometimes there was that I could adopt. And in terms of beliefs, reincarnation never appealed to me or seemed possible or likely. But other attitudes did seem just perfectly right. And I always said the moral compass in our song Faithless, where I've got my own moral compass and I've got my own spirit level. I do have a sense, always had a sense of right and wrong, and had a little judge on my shoulder, as they say about the Puritans, telling me what was right and wrong, and reproaching me if it was bad. I once compared it to in the old Disney cartoons, they would have Pluto would have, or Goofy would have the good Goofy and the bad Goofy on his shoulder, right? And that is a morality thing. We all have the good Goofy and the bad Goofy on our shoulders, and they always meant something to me. And I felt good if I did something nice, and I felt bad if I did something, crappy. And those still sustain me now. I have a sense of that, and a sense of outrage too, that people who are visibly mentally ill are still judged as if they were able-bodied people. And out on this coast, of course, we have a lot of homeless people here, and I always contribute to them willingly. And here's a beautiful illustration of a moment, and I'll hand them a note, and they say, oh, God bless you. I say, oh, no, God's got nothing to do with this. This is between you and me. And they go, oh yeah. And then I had one guy I saw a second time, and he started to say, God bless you. He said, no, wait, I remember, this is between you and me, right? I like that. And I said, I like it too.
Very cool. We're talking with Neil Peart of Rush, and here's another one from Clockwork Angels. BU2B2 from Rush's Clockwork Angels. In your book, Far and Near, there was a passage that I found very interesting when you talked about your trip through Selma, Alabama, and The reason it's touched me is that I had the privilege of meeting Rosa Parks, and I'll never forget that. It was at the President Clinton's first inauguration, and I had, still had long hair and, looked scruffy, but I put on, a nice suit, and got this interview with Ms. Parks, and went to this hotel, and walked in, and she had some sort of bodyguard there who was pretty rough looking. He looked like he meant business, and checked me and the guy that was with me out, which I was glad that he did. And then we were ushered into this room, and she was sitting there with 5 other grandmotherly looking ladies in their Sunday best.
Yeah.
And they were, talking, and I really felt like I was interrupting them, but I had to do it. So I was able to say to her, because I never got to say it to Dr. King, thank you for not only, of course, your work, civil rights movement to free African American people, but thank you for freeing me from the burden of bigotry. That was a huge gift that Dr. King and you gave me as a white person.
Yeah.
Not to have to carry that around for my life.
And we talked a bit before about having grown up through those times. And again, I'm eternally grateful to have grown up in the 1950s and the 1960s. But when we witnessed those things firsthand on our televisions and seeing fire hoses trained on people and little girls getting shouted, swear words at when they're trying to walk to school for the first time. And we saw those things happening around us and puzzled over them, as kids. Going, why is this going on? And to see it change increment by increment. So that the example you mentioned about my civil rights tour was just looking at the map one day where I had to go the next day and think, okay, how can I make this ride interesting? And I remembered those times and I thought, okay, Selma, rings large in my memory, and the March to Montgomery. So I said, okay, we're going to go to all those places. We're going to go through Montgomery and go through Selma and the bridge where he turned it around and kept it peaceful. And people don't realize perhaps why Dr. Martin Luther King is so celebrated, because he saved so many lives by not being confrontational when it was the wrong time. And he recognized at that moment, okay, look, this is all going against us. Let's turn around today, people, and try again later. And they did, and made it happen, and made that march happen, and got to the steps of the Capitol in Montgomery. And those times, and of course, I'm riding past cotton fields and considering, all that was and all that is, and of course, how much still remains to be done in the burden of American history. But to go through those places cognizantly of the past and being sensitive to what's around you, I think it's an observation you once made about watching the documentary where the three of us are having a well-refreshed dinner, and you commented that I was the greatest audience to Alex. And I took that to heart. Well, I am an audience kind of person, and one reason that the song Limelight caught me in a bind, because I don't want to be the focus of attention. I want to be the watcher. And I even on stage, I feel like the audience. I'm watching those people, what they respond to and how they're behaving and dancing, what's on their t-shirts. And, that's all to me. And when I'm on my motorcycle, the world is coming at me as a pageant, and I'm watching it as closely as I can, using that writer's exercise. How can I put this in words? Helps me make sense of it for myself. So, yes, going through history. And another time, a day off, I looked at Thomas Jefferson's home in Monticello in Virginia, and thought, yeah, I want to go there, because it's on the way. And just any points of interest like that, or reliving history, and if I can write about it in that sense for people who weren't around then, and remind them, of this was a time, or the nuclear age, when I'm traveling around the West and Los Alamos, New Mexico, and all that, the terrible shadow of nuclear devastation that we grew up on, and my father building a pathetic fallout shelter in the basement of our split-level house, with sleeping bags and water and a transistor radio. This was my childhood, and the when people talk about the Cuban crisis and the Bay of Pigs and all that, I lived it. I was only 10 years old, so when the neighbor dads are standing around talking about how the Russians are sure to bomb Niagara Falls, which is 20 miles from our house. You know, can you imagine what a 10-year-old kid thinks hearing those kind of things? So, of course, it impressed upon me hugely forever that that's the world I lived in, that it was that fragile. And then seeing the Vietnam protests on television, Kent State, all the civil rights struggles of those times, the assassinations of both Kennedys, of course, and Dr. King, those were things that happened that I was standing on the schoolyard steps and was told about, you know, that changed the world forever and certainly changed me.
And a song from that era in particular got to you when you were just 13.
Yeah, well, of course, the Selma, Alabama comes up in this song called Eve of Destruction that was a big hit in those days by Barry McGuire, I think written by P.F. Sloan. And one of the all-time great drummers, too, Hal Blaine, playing drums on it. So a lot of stories, when I look into the history of things like that, or the Monterey Pop Festival, or, you know, what really happened behind the scenes at Woodstock when I've been writing about them and needed to get my facts straight, or when I wrote, speaking of the nuclear age, writing the Manhattan Project and addressing the birth of the atomic bomb, well, I needed to get my facts straight. Right. And in those days, there was no Wikipedia. So I had the number of books I had to read to write those 200 words that a song holds, you know, just to get my facts straight and to understand what these scientists were going through, you know, being sequestered off in the desert to invent the ultimate weapon ever. These things are huge resonance. And as a human being, you think, okay, these were young people, you know, young men and women who went there and lived through that time. So it comes alive for me, and then you try to make it alive for other people. So anytime I see a bit of American, it's not American history, is it? It's world history. It's human history. So, of course, if I can dwell on those a little bit along the way and remind people who maybe weren't around what a crazy old world we grew up in.
Amen. Amen. Well, I'm going to pass on the song for a minute because I'm looking at the clock here. So imagine that I played Eve of Destruction.
Eve of Destruction. But you can hear it in your heads if you're of a certain age.
There you go. Let's talk about songwriting for just a moment. Tell us how the band works out a new song. How you bring in, is it lyrics first, music first? How does that work?
Yeah, it's evolved over time to a sense, but really at this point, I just write a bunch of lyrics without investing too much in them and pass them over to Geddy and Alex, and they jam. It really is as simple and as organic as that. The two of them will just sit in front of a recording machine and start playing, and then Geddy, being the patient and meticulous one, will go through and pick out the high points of what they've done. Then he'll turn to my sheets of lyrics and find things that fit and say, okay, well, this 2 lines maybe out of a whole page, right? That's why I learned not to invest myself in it or present one piece of work. Here's a song I've been working on, you know, for days. It's got to be just like it is. I'm not that possessive yet about it. And if Geddy likes 2 lines of them and they work in a song, then I'm happy already. You know, I'm inspired already that something worked. And if he says, oh, I need 4 more lines like this and maybe another bit like that, I run off to my desk like, yahoo, you know, it's going to work. There's a moment in writing lyrics that I always find, not when I finish, but I've struggled with it for days and it doesn't seem like it's going to work and I'm ready to abandon songwriting forever. I should never have done this. I can't do it. And then something turns around and a light goes off and all I think is, it's going to work. And there might be another day's work there. And the same thing when a song, when Geddy fastens onto those few lines and it's going to work, then I'm already inspired. So I'm more than happy to go back and do the necessary craft work to make that happen. So, and then there's infinite refinement going back and forth. And Geddy, as a singer, of course, has to feel comfortable with the words, not necessarily in their meaning only, but in the way they deliver as music, right? Sure. That's a lesson I had to learn, that things that looked good on the page and sounded good spoken in my head weren't necessarily that great to sing. And I've learned more about that over time and still continue to learn. And when Geddy tells me that a line is great to sing, then I learn to model after those combinations of beats, right? Words are rhythm to me, and especially in lyrics. That's why I think I gravitated toward it, because I'd always loved words and reading, but it was a chance to rhythmically phrase those words, and that's the way they always drop into my head as rhythms.
Wow, that's fantastic, and thank God you have developed this collaborative effort with Geddy and Alex, that you can work in that way and raise the standard of the song rather than look at me, look what I did. It's
Or
what
fighting
we
it
did.
down till it's some consensus that doesn't have anything left
Yeah.
of what you intended in it. Fortunately, there's never that sense of loss. It's always a sense of enrichment. And more so, even in our individual parts, I always find that once my drum parts have been through our collective ideas, and it's not a committee by any means, and it's not a democracy, right? I can't come up with a drum set and or a drum part and two of us like it and one doesn't, or a song that two of us like and one doesn't. That's never going to work over time,
Right.
right? One story I love to tell is the instrumentals are always the hardest for all of us to like them. And on Snakes and Arrows, I guess it was, the song called "The Main Monkey Business." We worked on that song probably 5 times as long as we worked on any of the vocal musical songs,
Wow.
because all of us want so much out of that instrumental, and we want to be pleased with it melodically, dynamically, instrumentally, all of those elements. So it actually takes longer to arrive at that consensus. But when we do, we have something that we're comfortable with, not just then, but to play for the next 40 years. That's the remarkable thing that I was saying, that we never have to choose our songs based on what we can stand to play, because almost all of them come back and go, oh yeah, we are still the people that we were then, still respond to the excitement that made a drum part is always inspired by excitement, right? This is kind of drumming that's exciting for me to listen to, so it's the kind of drumming that's exciting for me to play, and you hope to communicate that the listeners, again, like I said from the outset, the simplest statement, we make the music we like and hope others do, but there's a lot in that in terms of the excitement and the passion that I had as a 15-year-old kid hearing Keith Moon play, right? I want that excitement in my playing too, ideally.
Well, let me turn this around for a minute, since we discussed how your passion for, and you guys are such great songwriters, but then you did an album that appreciated other people's songwriting.
Yeah.
Feedback.
Yeah, and that was going right back to our roots again. It touches on just what I just said, the music that got us excited about the whole idea of being in a band and writing songs and playing them every night. And those were the songs we went back to again that were part of all of us. Of course, there were ones that were more individual choices, but those were ones that mattered to all of us in those formative times. So it was absolutely, that was 10 years ago when we were a mere 30 years old as a band then, youngsters. But we wanted to commemorate that in a sense, and we did talk about that this time. But in a sense, having done that, there were still more songs, of course, that we would gladly interpret, which is what a cover record is. But it was hard to go back. It always is.
Well, if you don't mind, I'm going to play my favorite cover version from
Please.
Feedback. And when I heard you guys were doing this, I thought, well, that's going to be interesting. And then I heard, they're going to cover some Buffalo Springfield tunes. And it stopped me in my tracks. I went, wait a minute, Rush is going to do Buffalo Springfield? Come on. Somebody's pulling my leg. And the way that you guys do Mr. Soul just killed me. Let me just play that for a minute.
Go.
So this was a song that you obviously loved and...
Oh, absolutely. And For What It's Worth was the other Buffalo Springfield one that Alex just remembers loving that song so much as a kid. And that inspires you. How can you love music so much, that you want to be a part of it?
Mr. Soul from Rush. Rush, in a great version of the Buffalo Springfield song, Mr. Soul. My guest tonight is Neil Peart, and we've been talking about his book, the 40th Anniversary Rush Tour, which kicks off in May, I believe.
Yes.
May. And I want to ask you this question here, because we're running short on time. Let's talk about your priorities at this stage of your life.
Well, that's tough. But the same drives for travel and writing absolutely remain, and devoted to that absolutely. I always say now I would be happy, instead of going on the road for a month and then coming home for a week and writing about it, now I'd rather stay home for the month, go away for a few days, and come back and spend my time writing about it. So I'm still motivated by the same charm, somehow that word came up, but yeah, charmed by the world in a kind of absolutely magical way. So still, even places that I'm familiar with, the deserts of California, the whole American Southwest, all of that calls to me absolutely still, and I want to find better ways to convey that to others. Right now, of course, the major ambition is developing the tour, and I'll start my rehearsals typically a month before the band rehearsals. Getty always jokes that I'm the only musician he knows that rehearses to rehearse. But I like to come in on day one with all of the songs already. I've not only my drumming technique is performance ready, but all the songs and the nuances of transitions and tempos and all that are logged already. So at least one of us is going to know what he's doing on day one.
For you, and by God, it's going to be you. So there's also a passage in the book where you talk about you love to be on stage, you love the audience, no question about it. But it is hard for you to leave home. And explain that a little bit.
Oh, yeah, I'm getting that already. People saying, are you excited to be going on tour? And, that conveys a whole bunch of fantasy that I don't want to dump on other people's fantasies necessarily. But when they're talking about my own life, I say, well, I have a 5-year-old daughter. Am I excited to be leaving my 5-year-old daughter? What would that say about me if I said that, right?
Yeah.
And I have a wife and a home and a dog and my office and my pleasures and my kitchen, do I want to leave all those things? No. Am I excited about that? No. I talked a while ago about the responsibility of being a professional musician, and I decided long ago, around 1990, I was pretty weary of touring. And I thought, I'm pretty much done with this part of it. And then as I thought about it, and again, how do I know what I think until I see what I write? And started writing about it and realized, well, you know what? If you are a musician, you play live, right? That is the ultimate test of a musician. It's the ultimate expression of what a musician does. So I told myself that. How long ago? 25 years ago, told myself, well, you have to tour because,
right.
it's what you do. And live performance remains the ultimate crucible and litmus test of what a musician is made of, what a band is made of. And of course, it's what made us. Live performance is how we found our audience. By opening all those shows, by playing all those clubs, is how we gradually built an audience who even knew who we were, and then started to respond to the commitment that we brought to the stage every night. So it just seems necessary, right? And I said also earlier on, in the first years of touring in 1974, I already found it wanting as a way of life. I thought, oh, this is no good. And I kind of divide my touring life into decades after that, where the first 10 years I spent reading. And I just became the most voracious reader of fiction and nonfiction, and filled in all the gaps in my education that a teenage dropout drummer, is going to have. And then bicycling. In the 1980s, I started carrying a bicycle on the tour bus and got out on days off and on show days and rode around the different towns, and found another mission where I started visiting the art museums as a kind of a little excuse to go for a bicycle ride, right. And then garnered a whole new education in all the great art museums there are across the United States, and cities that people wouldn't expect. Like in Kansas City, St. Louis, Portland, Oregon has a great collection of African art, the things that you can find, and made touring worthwhile.
Right.
And then once I started to love the bicycling just for being part of the real world on back roads and city streets and that, and feeling a part of something outside the bubble, that really got to me. And once I started motorcycling, I realized, I can expand this palette so much more and be part of that real world nearly all the time. And that is so nourishing, reassuring, feeling in touch with real life and with other people, having wonderful little encounters with people at gas stations. And one little example I always like to tell is that we were in Iowa, a little gas station, Michael and I filling up our motorcycles, and there's an older lady in Iowa, and with her Buick, and she's filling up her gas, and she calls over to us without a hint of being threatened by guys in big leather suits around, and she says, I'll pay for yours if you'll pay for mine. Oh. It's just a beautiful little moment of human trust, right? Where she felt she could say that to us and felt moved to, and us to be delighted by, to this day. Of those kind of moments are the ones that I remember and want to judge the country by. And when people start dumping on a different part of the country, I can always come back in its defense from having known it so much better than most Americans do, and having had these treasured little moments all over the place at rest areas and diners and hotels and stuff.
You are a lucky man. You are well, I don't know. No,
Something I said about magic. There's such a thing as magic, but it often takes some planning. I think luck. You know, there is such a thing as luck, but you have to be there.
Yeah.
Or Picasso said about inspiration. Yes, there's inspiration, but it likes you to be at work.
You have to tend the garden.
Yeah, man.
Beautiful song called The Garden from Rush. Well, we're running out of time here, so there's some things that I need to do before we say goodnight. First is to remind you that Rush is about to launch their R40 Live Tour, and they're going to be in 34 cities throughout North America this summer, beginning May 8th, which I don't know is technically summer, to be honest with you. But nonetheless, it's in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the garden spot of America. But you will be finishing in the greatest city, which is L.A.
And we're excited that it's the Forum, too, because when we were mapping this out, you know, and what would be the greatest tribute to those 40 years, and while if we could finish in Toronto, of course, would be great. To finish in Cleveland would be great, because it really started for us in the United States there. But the Forum goes back with so much history for us. And even before us, I can remember in the 60s hearing the live albums, Vanilla Fudge at the Forum and Three Dog Night live at the LA Forum. It was a place I heard of long before I ever dreamed that I would play there.
Have you seen the new Forum?
I have not, but I've heard wonderful things.
Oh my God! I'll tell you, Irving Azoff and the people he put together did an extraordinary job. And from a musician standpoint, the acoustics there are brilliant. I mean, they really spent a lot of time and money to make sure that the sound of the Forum was spectacular, and it is. I mean, people will be able to hear you from the nosebleed seats perfectly.
Great.
Yeah, and the backstage ain't too bad either.
Good.
Before we get to the last question, I want to make sure that I thank some folks here. And what did I do with that piece of paper? Hold on one second, because there's some good folks that I need to thank here, and who have helped get this interview together. And one is, of course, the lovely Megan, who you guys work with, and she was very, very helpful, Megan Simsick. And also, of course, Dominic Nardella of SiriusXM, Dave Wellington and Greg Steele of SiriusXM, also Steve Leeds from SiriusXM, Bill Hunning, who was very helpful, Michael Mosbach, who got you here on time, and the lovely Helene Hodge-Ladd. We thank all of you for your help in getting this show together tonight. It was really appreciated. It does take a village, as you said earlier. So, the last topic tonight is, it seems to me that you are a man who crams more living into his daily life than anybody I know. You are constantly, and my question is, are you constantly hearing the clock of life ticking in your head?
No, I'm glad to say that it isn't that kind of urgency at all. It's a sense of eagerness, anticipation, and the value that I put on a day is what's the most excellent thing I can do today. And on touring life, of course, if I have a chance to escape from that on my motorcycle and go explore some scenery and history and all that, that's an excellent way, if I have to be somewhere far from home, to make use of that time. And at home we've had our sabbatical during the last 18 months or so, and I sat up from the beginning so grateful for that time to be able to sit at my desk and write every day, and just have that kind of get up in the morning at home, come home at night, cook dinner for the family. I decided I was going to do something for someone else every day, even if it was just a thank you note to a stranger for a gift on tour, write a letter to a friend that I knew would appreciate it. I had a friend who wanted a foreword for his book of drum transcriptions, all those kind of things that I would spend a little time every single day, and still do, that's not for me, but someone I care for or care about, or just a thing well worth doing. Again, a stranger, sending them a little thank you that I know will mean the world to them, and make it a part of the day. So the most excellent thing you can do in a day becomes then a fabric to weave, and it includes spending time with my daughter is an excellent thing to be able to do that I can't do if I'm on my way to Indianapolis, for example. Cooking dinner for a family is a worthwhile, excellent thing to do. Cooking food for people is an excellent thing to do. So I kind of base it on that, and at the end of the day, have figured, well, I did some good things. I did the writing that I love to do, spent time with friends, perhaps, did that little gold star moment for someone else, maybe far away, maybe a stranger, maybe a friend, and I go to sleep happy and wake up happy.
You know, for someone who is not religious, would the word spiritual work with you? Because you seem almost in a Zen way to be very aware of looking at life in a very taking the importance of every moment.
Appreciative, absolutely, I appreciate it, and the moments. And we were talking about the moonrise before, right? Watching a full moonrise and never taking it for granted. No, I never do. And home life, you know, never take it for granted. And the people around me and friends, those are transitory. And I've learned to my cost, unfortunately, that those things are transitory. But I always got my late drum teacher again, Freddie Gruber. I've got to bring up because it comes back to me so often. One of his tenets of life, after all that he'd gone through in 80 plus years, was, it is what it is, deal with it. And that's the fundamental realism that some people hate, that kind of acceptance of the concrete reality of things. But on the other hand, it's a foundation, a concrete foundation to build upon, and accepting the reality. And if you can make it better or contribute to it in some meaningful way, I was saying before, just helping a homeless person on the street, or sharing a moment of small talk at a gas station in Iowa, or a service center pull off somewhere, having a moment with someone that you know brightened their day and yours, well, that feels awfully great to walk away from.
Wow. Well, I can't imagine what your answer is going to be to this last question, but, you know, since we have in your line of credits, just off the top of my head, drummer, lyricist, motorcycle rider, writer of books, botanist, historian, now I find out that you're a chef. Is there something in life that you would like to do and you've never tried?
Probably not, honestly, because I would make it a point to find that opportunity. And I said before about magic, there is magic in life, but it takes some planning. And that's the kind of way that I approach a day in that sense. And if I wanted to learn something like cooking, that's a fine example. I always thought it was magic. And Alex was one of the people that he would spend all day, if we were away in the country working on songs or something, he would spend all day cooking. And I didn't understand it when I was young. And then later I did. Well, it's the ultimate expression of love to cook for people. So once I had that understanding, then it became something worth doing. And it's not magic, you know, that you can find. And on my website, I have a subsection called Bubba's Bar and Grill. And it's just to transmit that boys, Bubba's, this is not magic. Here's the simple instructions: how to cook a carrot, how to cook a piece of fish. You know, if you want to impress a lady, bake her a pie. And you can find it all on Bubba's Bar and Grill.
Well, there you go. Ladies and gentlemen, Neil Peart, I so enjoyed this.
Likewise. Thank you so much. Always a pleasure. For 35 years at least, we've been doing this.
We'll do it for another 35.
Keep doing it.
All right. Here's to the next 35. Deep Tracks, SiriusXM. Thank you, Neil.
Thank you, sir.
Saved one of my favorite Rush songs for last. It's hard to choose because I have so many, but that's Time Stands Still. I'm Jim Ladd. I want to thank you for listening and for being my friend this evening. I want to thank Neil for his kindness and his generosity of time to be here. And I always enjoy talking to this guy. It's always a pleasure. Although you do have to do homework. You have to prepare. You know, you have to actually do the work. But it's always worthwhile. Join me again tomorrow for another 4 hours of free-form rock and roll radio high in the Hollywood Hills. Until then, good night, everybody.